Welcome to a 5 Live Sports special, where for the next hour we'll be discussing the difficult issue of abuse in sport, here as part of the Sport Resolutions Conference in London. You'll be hearing first-hand accounts from survivors of abuse, including a harrowing testimony from a former gymnast who will share with us how her coach abused her from the age of 12. We'll ask what's being done to catch the abusers and protect current and future athletes. I'll be joined by a panel of experts who'll give us a national and international perspective. I will ask how sport can learn from the crises in public bodies such as the Church, the NHS and the BBC. Well, in our audience are leaders from some of our biggest sporting institutions, as well as current and former athletes. You'll hear from some of them over the next hour. First, though, we're going to hear from a survivor. Gloria Viceras is a Spanish Olympic gymnast and a former national champion in her sport. For the next 20 minutes, Dr. Phil Hopley, consultant psychiatrist who runs a confidential helpline service across 14 sports in the UK, will talk to Gloria about what happened to her during her gymnastics career and how it's impacted on her life since she left the sport. Please welcome Dr. Phil Hopley and Gloria Viceras.
So Gloria, first of all, a big thank you on behalf of everybody here for taking the brave step of sharing your story with us. We're going to explore a number of difficult and challenging issues, but this all sits in the context of sport, that amazing thing that so many people benefit from and engage in. Gymnasts hit that success at a very young age, so I imagine for you, getting involved in sport started early. And I wonder if you could start by telling us about how you came to be a gymnast.
When I was 3, my family lived in Mexico City. My father was a journalist and was working there. So I don't remember anything, but they tell me they took me to the gymnastics arena to see Vera Kapslavska. And they always say how they had to drag me out of the gyms screaming because I didn't want to leave the arena. After that, my life got literally upside down. I became more down than up, and so when we moved back to Spain, my parents looked for a place for me to practice gymnastics, with mats and a pit and a coach. So
and was that a local club or a school set up?
I started in a local club, but quite early they saw that I had some potential, so it was like at 8. I started working out in the National Training Center. I started with a coach, a Russian coach called Nina. I had very good memories of her. She used to tell us all the time to be krasiva. Krasiva means pretty in Russian. She told us to be out there and be like a Russian Tsarina. So we got on the beam and became Katalina the First of Russia. So she was nice. And I was happy times there.
You say happy times. I mean, how much did you enjoy what you were doing, and how focused were you, and how important was gymnastics in the life of this young girl?
It was my life. It was my passion. I just wanted to do gymnastics. That's and represent my country at the Olympics, and be like Vera Kapslavska at the time. Then Nadia Comaneci, but at first it was just back when gymnastics was a sport for women. So I was one of the first girl gymnasts in my country. I'm known for that.
And so that passion was combined with that drive, and it sounds as if you really enjoyed what you were doing.
Yeah.
And as a parent of children who love sports, there's the very wonderful experience that you get as a parent, watching them develop and get those very widespread benefits of achievement, sociability, personal development. But I wonder, what was the involvement of your family around gymnastics in the early years?
Well, I was 8. They had to take me to the gym and bring me back home. They didn't have any holidays because I had to train. It was, the whole family had to be involved in it.
So dedication following.
Yeah.
When did things become difficult? When did things change? You described getting into that national setup and really enjoying the work with that first coach. When did things change?
She decided to move back home, and then Jesus Carvalho, who was the national coach for the men, started helping her with us. There were 5, we were about 9 or 10 years old, and we were the hopefuls. And he started coaching us. And when she left, he stayed. He took care of that group of girls, and started.
What was he like to begin with?
He was very charming. We found very nice, and we very funny his little games like of seduction. He would give a little kiss to my teammate and then look at me like saying, if you're good, I'll give you one, like 2. But then it started getting wrong. He started like forbidding us to speak with the boys in the gym. There were boys our age with whom we just played hide and seek the day before, and all of a sudden we couldn't even look at them, we couldn't say hello, we couldn't answer a good morning, and we have to sit in the gym and looking down to the floor. And then he started humiliating us or insulting us. He called me a whore all the time, and he just waited. He was testing the limits, he waited to see if we told our parents. And so it developed like that. Then he started giving us a massage in the warm-up room in the basement, and that's how it all started, yeah.
And meanwhile, your parents are driving you back and forth from training, and there's been a very significant change in your experience of this sporting environment. Were they aware at that young age?
I think I never spoke with my father. Died some years ago, and without knowing what had happened to me. But I think he knew something was wrong. After the Olympics, the first day that I came out crying, he went for the coach and had a very strong discussion. I was outside just hearing how they screamed at each other, and he never let me go back. So I guess he knew something was wrong, didn't know what the extent of it was. But facing another Olympic cycle like that, he just thought he was not going to go for it. I mean, he just pulled me out of there.
But this was years after the abuse had started.
Yeah.
And am I right in understanding, as is often the case with paedophiles, that the environment was very carefully controlled, that there was a culture of fear, that there was not just the sexual abuse, but the psychological control and manipulation? That was all part of the package.
He controlled every aspect of our lives. He controlled what we ate. He controlled what music we listened. He used to control our CDs. He controlled everything. You have to understand that in gymnastics, the bond is really very strong because you trust your coach with your life, literally. So if he told me to go up on the beam and do a double back of it, I would go up and do it. If he told me not to eat dinner that night, I would not eat dinner. And I would not question him if he made me do bars with a cast on my leg. And I would not question him if he ordered me to open my mouth for him.
And do you think that this was just directed at you at the time?
No, I think there were others. I didn't want to know about that back then. Today I know there were others. Actually, he married one of my teammates years later. And he lives with her and has a son with her today.
In the work that I do, Gloria, we see the very significant psychological damage that follows in the aftermath of child sexual abuse. How did this impact on you?
It still has an impact on me today. I still suffer from the consequences of it. I spent 30 years just keeping that secret, so I didn't have any treatment back then. I spent 30 years trying to cope with migraines, suicide attempts, bulimia, 12 years of bulimia. And, it's really hard.
You said to me earlier that you thought when your father pulled you out of that national training camp, things would be better, and there was a sense of relief.
Yeah, it was, I couldn't have made that decision, so it was a relief for me. It was very liberating. And I thought since the sexual abuse had stopped, that everything else would stop and everything would be okay and I would start being a normal kid. But I was very wrong. You know, when you get pulled out of such a controlled, disciplined environment, it's like being left alone in a street, in a place you don't know, with people you don't know, that speak a language you don't know, and knowing that you will never be able to go back to the life that you've known before. So it's like you don't know how to live your new life, and it takes a lot of effort to move on.
I see this with transition under less traumatic circumstances in every sport that we work with, and that loss of identity and moving from something that you're passionate about to something where you feel slightly out of place and you're not quite sure who you are is difficult for a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old. The younger you are, the earlier your career is interrupted, quite often the bigger the impact. And there you were as a teenager having this beset you. So in the aftermath of that, what did you feel about gymnastics? What did you feel about sport? What was your relationship like?
I stopped anything to do with sport. I didn't even watch sport on TV afterwards. For many years, I didn't want to have anything to do. I just wanted to run away and not look back. And that's what I did. I didn't have anything else to do with sport after that,
So
until recently.
The experience tainted all of your experience about sport prior to that, but here you are today being incredibly brave, as I said before, sharing your story. So what has changed?
Well, 4 years ago, I decided to share some pictures with some of my old teammates with whom I hadn't had any contact in over 30 years. So we started meeting again, we started talking, and we realized that we hadn't been, that I hadn't been the only one suffering from this. We found out that the federation, the Gymnastics Federation, had known about it, didn't know anything about it. And I realized that I had some witnesses to the abuse, direct witnesses. So it became very, very important for us to speak up because he was still coaching the national team and there were very young girls at his care. So we thought, what if he had been abusing the girls for 30 years? So we had to speak up. And it's been very difficult, but we've managed to make some changes with it, so I'm happy about that.
And those changes, and of course being here today is a great opportunity to share this story and push those changes forward. What is it you're seeking to achieve?
Well, I want, when you speak about violence in sport, you tend to think about a bunch of fans fighting on the stands of a football match. And what I want is that society moves away from the stands for a little bit and looks down on the field. There is a lot of violence happening on the fields and in the gyms, in the pools against athletes. And until we acknowledge that, and until we listen to people who have suffered what I suffered, and learn how these environments work, only then we can start working on prevention and on putting all the control mechanisms in place so that children can do sport safely and healthily.
And are there specific programs you're involved in at the moment that are seeking to increase awareness and open the door and therefore allow the opportunity for preventative strategies?
Yeah, right now I am in a project called Voice. It's an EU project. It's funded by the Erasmus Plus fund. And it's all about hearing the voices of those who were affected by sexual abuse in sport. So, you can find us in the net, Voices for Truth and Dignity, and I invite everybody who's been affected by this to come forward and tell us your story because, society needs to listen to those stories. And listen not just with your ears, you have to listen with your eyes, with your heart. You have to listen to those athletes who stop smiling, to the athletes who stop eating, and because the signs are always there. And only after you listen to those stories and learn how those environments work and how those pedophiles do their grooming and all this stuff, only then you can understand and you can really work on prevention.
And how are people responding to that opportunity to come forward and share?
We are at the very early stages of the project, but we are already having some response to that, and it's going to be very positive. It's going to be positive for those who participate in the project, because it's very liberating to be able to speak about that in an environment where you're protected. It can be confidential or it can be in the open. It's all about, it's up to whoever, to the person.
What people are comfortable
Yeah.
with. And in terms of the support and help that you eventually accessed, what was helpful for you?
We decided to go to the sports ministry and ask for help, because we were very worried about the kids that were still at his care. And they provided all the support and all the counseling that we needed, legal counseling and psychological counseling. I've been in treatment now, finally, for the cause of all my problems. Because, usually you tend to treat the symptoms. They treat you for the bulimia, but they don't treat you for the cause of the problem. So I've been in treatment now for 2 years, and I'm doing really well. And, it helps me a lot with my, going forward with my life.
I'm sure it does, and I'm sure the proof of it being successful
Yeah.
is the fact that you're sitting here talking to me in a live radio interview.
Mm-hmm.
You're also a mother, and you had this very sensitizing experience around sport. So what's your attitude been as a parent towards your children in sport?
Actually, I have an elite athlete in my older son is silver world medalist in handball when he was a teenager, when he was in the junior category. So my experience, what I try to do is to keep an open line of communication with my children, because before they're able to tell you something important, they have to be able to tell you a lot of unimportant things, and you have to listen to all of them. So I hope that by doing this, they will be able to talk to me and tell me if something happens to them.
And how aware of your story are they?
Oh, my oldest sons, I have a 24 and a 21-year-old. They learned about it when I disclosed. They didn't know about that before. The little one is still, we'll try to keep her a little bit from it. Still, she's 9, so but we will do it with her too.
The time has to be right, but as you say, how you create that environment for open dialogue is
Yeah.
a critical skill. And what about skills for coaches and organisations? What should people be aware of? What should we be doing in terms of safeguarding strategies?
Actually, I do. Sometimes I speak in front of future coaches, because I think that is very productive. They need to be aware of things and to be able to protect the athletes. Like I said, listen to the athletes. The signs are always there, and we need to put more protection mechanisms in place for those environments not to become an environment in which the abuse can take place.
And what would you like to see specifically in terms of authority responses in Spain, for example?
Oh, for a start, I would like the statute of limitations to be removed from Spain, so that we can at least put our abusers in front of a judge. But there is a lot of work to do on prevention, on setting up the protocols within the clubs, within the basic structures of sport. There's nothing done on that.
And finally, here you are as a parent, your own children. There's been a huge shift in society between attitudes when you were a child and attitudes now. There's much more access to information. People are more aware. And I'm sure that your parents, like my parents, weren't those people that would be comfortable talking about sex, for example. But what advice, looking back, would you as a parent now give to yourself as that young gymnast in order to make that person better able to protect themselves?
That's a difficult question, because I still think that if I look back at how I was and how things were back then, I still think I wouldn't have been able to speak up. But what I think is that it's not for the victims to speak up, but for the adults to act, and for the adults to provide the safe environments for the children. So that's what I think needs to be done is to teach families to recognize the signs, but to work from the bottom up and to work on prevention from the lower levels of sport, the sport structures.
Thank you. And it was wonderful that eventually your father could see that this outgoing, happy, very engaged child had changed in nature and picked up on those signs. So educating parents is obviously a key part of this as well.
Yeah.
Gloria, thank you so much
You're
for that
welcome.
brave sharing, and if the audience would join me in thanking you.
I just wanted to back up what Phil has said, Gloria. Thank you so much for talking to us so honestly about what happened to you. And I just wanted to maybe follow up with a couple of questions of my own. And you talked about the fact that you felt obviously betrayed by your coach, but then the fact that your federation allowed him to continue to work for 30 years. Did you feel betrayed by them as well, by that federation?
Yes. Do you know that still today I haven't received one phone call from anybody in that federation? Today, the son of my abuser is the president of the Spanish Gymnastics Federation, and there's nothing we can do with them. I mean, we are completely banned.
So do you think that they have been in denial about what happened to you and to the other athletes?
Yes, they certainly are.
And you mentioned as well that you talked to your teammates when you finally were able to talk to them, but none of you had ever talked about it before.
No.
I suppose that's the secrecy that goes around child abuse in a way.
Yes, it becomes one of your more important goals in your life is to keep that secret, because you were raised to be a role model. You're raised to be a champion, and being a little slut is not being a role model, and that's what you believe when you go through that. You believe it's your fault, you believe you're responsible for what he's doing to you, and you don't want anybody to know about that.
And Phil, the fact that you're talking to somebody like Gloria, who is in a sport like gymnastics, which, as you said, is something which draws in its athletes extremely young, is it no coincidence that somebody who is a paedophile is drawn to being a coach in a sport like that?
No, I think that's no surprise at all. And if we think about the account that Gloria gave, particularly around the way in which that coach started off as being very charming, very seductive, very positive, creating an environment where he was trusted. And then once he was the only coach working with the squad, he very quickly moved to a situation where everything was rigidly controlled. I understand, Gloria, that you would come to training an hour before all the other girls and would have to wait in the warm-up room or the massage room, and that's where the abuse would take place. He was able to manipulate the system so effectively that that's what made it a sort of an ideal area for him to be a predator.
And did he encourage you to not tell anybody? Presumably that was the whole thing. Was it? You hear people talking about saying, "This is our secret."
Yeah, but he used many. I mean, like I said, gymnastics is a dangerous sport. When you're learning a trick, for example, and at first you need to be spotted, you need to be helped, you need to have the mats put in place. And he used to say, well, if you're not good, then you'll do the double back all by yourself today. So, or he would punish you to go up 20 ropes with bleeding hands when you had bleeding hands from doing bars. So he knew how to manipulate, and he knew how to manipulate one with one thing and the other one with other things. So he knew who to pick.
And we have a room full of people here who work in sport, who work in a range of different sports. Do you think that some of them may have to think, is there anybody in our organisation who is like your coach was? Can people here look at themselves and look at their organisation and think, this is not a problem that we have?
They need to look good. I think, like I said, I think the signs are always there. When the athletes stop smiling, stop driving, stop going there with a smile on their faces, when the environments become too controlled, when there is too much power, when one person has too much power over the whole structure in a club or in an organization, you have to raise the the alarm, because you have to really think what's going on and do something, act on it.
And Phil, we've said that you run a helpline. How hard is it for athletes to come out and speak and to pick up the phone and talk about such things?
And I think it's very difficult, because if you think about the whole nature of being a sportsman or a sportswoman, it's all about success, it's all about victory, it's all about performing to the best of your abilities. And if, as is commonly the case, there is stigma around abuse, it's similar with mental health issues, there's going to be a perception that by declaring this issue, it's going to impact on how you're perceived by your coaches, your club, your teammates. So it's very difficult. The stigma is definitely shifting. One of the key things in this area is to ensure that support that's available is confidential, absolutely confidential, and sits outside the management structure that the player is working in. Because as you can imagine, if you're someone who has an issue like this, the impact on maybe contract renegotiations or how you're perceived can be massive. So it has to sit independent of that, and that's where the sports associations in this country do really wonderful work by providing and funding these helpline type services.
How do you feel about the sport of gymnastics now, Gloria?
I watch gymnastics from the sidelines. I'm trying to reconciliate with my sport. Actually, one of the reasons why it all started moving inside of me was the day my daughter came to me and said she wanted to try to do gymnastics, artistic gymnastics. And that was very hard for me to let her try. But I don't want to have much to do with it, in the day to day.
So you're happy to let her
do
gymnastics?
I did. I sat in a gym from a friend of mine has a gym, and I sat and watched the training sessions for like 20 or 30 days before I even started letting my daughter go there. But, until I knew that everything was safe and everything was fine there, I didn't let her. But she tried. She said she didn't like it, and now she's playing basketball, so that's good.
Well, she's found a sport that she loves, which is the important thing.
That's
We all want to
right.
be able to love the sport that we do, and we let our children do as well.
That's right.
Gloria, thank you for telling us your story.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Phil as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And everybody, please, another round of applause for Phil. Welcome back to our special 5 Live Sport programme on surviving abuse in sport from the Sport Resolutions Conference in London, where leaders from some of the country's top sporting bodies are joined by current and former athletes and legal experts. Well, earlier on we heard the first-hand account of Gloria Viceras, a Spanish Olympic gymnast who was abused by her coach. She talked about how it began with seduction by giving massages, and then the control, the bond between the coach and the athlete turned it into something very much more sinister, but she is now brave enough to come out and talk about her experiences. So we're now going to talk about how safe sport is for athletes here in the UK, what sporting bodies are doing to protect the young people in its care, and as the Goddard inquiry looks into abuse scandals in public institutions such as the church, the NHS and the BBC, how robust are the safeguarding policies in sport? Well, joining me are Andy Parkinson, who's Chief Executive of British Rowing, Catherine Starr, founder and president of Safe for Athletes, who represented Great Britain in swimming at the Olympics and Commonwealth Games, and is also herself a survivor of abuse. Michael Pether is partner at BLM Law and specialises in defending abuse claims. And Anne Tivas is director of the NSPCC Child Protection in Sport Unit. Welcome to the four of you. Gloria is also with us still in the audience, so if you want to ask Gloria any particular questions, or Phil, then please feel free to do so. But let's just reflect, Catherine, with you first of all on Gloria's story. How typical is it of the stories that you hear from young athletes who've been abused?
Well, my listening to Gloria triggers, my experience of, when I started, what happened. But I think, listening to her story this morning, was, sort of hearing the dissipation of the passion. And I think that's what it gets turned inward into the pain that one experiences who's been abused. And And that for me, it's like being able to, I started at 3, and I think Gloria said she started at 3, and there's, I slept in my swimsuit when I was a child. I mean, you wake up in the morning and you have like indents into your skin because you're so excited, to like get in the pool, and, just like that desire, and watching my first Olympic Games, where I could remember I was 8 years old, and my neighbor had won 4 golds and 1 silver, and I grew up on a street in the U.S. that we had 5 Olympians on this one street. I was the only non-gold medalist, but the excitement and the bond that I had with my father, watching those Olympic Games, and then it turn into this separation of, not being able to share your experience, and, just that the sadness. And certainly also what triggered for me was seeing the sadness in Gloria's eyes as we flashed through the pictures at the beginning of her share. And it was hard for me just to look at that, because I saw her pain. And I think, I'm very connected to, a lot of athletes certainly a lot of athletes today, and just to understand that depth of that experience, and for somebody to be on the other side and say, I know, I've been there, I feel that, is, it's a bond that you don't want to have ideally, but it's also a blessing to be able to connect with that. So, and I'm sorry for your experience.
Anne, what about you? You've heard Gloria speak before, haven't you?
Yes, I have heard Gloria speak before, and the first time that we heard her speak, the audience was almost unanimously in tears, and we had a senior minister from the Austrian government present there who was actually unable to speak because of what she had just heard, and it was an entirely appropriate response to what had been heard. And I think there's we hear a lot of this. Obviously, in 15 years of the Child Protection in Sport unit, we've heard just about every poor experience that you can have. We've been very, very fortunate in that we've had very strong leadership from the sports councils in the UK that have encouraged this work to be developed, encouraged governing bodies to respond, and to build on probably the biggest need, which is to give athletes a voice. I think that's one of the things that Gloria spoke very clearly about. Children and young people, particularly in sport, were not listened to for a very long time, whereas in the rest of their lives they might be able to have a school counsellor or have a youth council in their schools and other environments. Sport really wasn't set up for listening to its participants. That has been a sea change, but there is still a very, very long way to go. There will be athletes here and athletes in other countries preparing for Rio who can't speak out at the moment because of the risk of losing their medals, their place in teams. And we still need to do a lot more to create an open culture where all athletes, young and old, feel able to turn to somebody. But also I think the important point that Gloria made was that for most people, they can't speak. What's happening to them is so terrifying. They also see other people getting very poor responses in some sports, and they're frightened and don't know who they can turn to. So it does rely on the whole entourage, the whole of sport, to be prepared and to understand these are the indicators of something going wrong. I do need to speak out. I do need to do something.
So, Catherine, there are young athletes at this moment preparing to compete who are being abused by their coaches.
Yes, I can unequivocally say that I have worked with some elite athletes, and some of them are they're over the age of 18, and I think it becomes this lost, sort of understanding of not really understanding the power dynamic, and the commitment that you have. It's your commitment to your passion, and just witnessing this need to wait, and you have your financial well-being, that you're have this idea that the money that you have, this talent, and the money you're going to make is from sponsorships and everything else, and at the same time you know, in certain situations, you have the other people who are, you know, are following up behind, and they're walking into these situations that are extremely abusive. And then you also have the situation of watching these coaches who are saying all the right things, but doing all the wrong things.
What kind of things?
Well, just the, you know, how there's a need to support a safe sport environment, and, you know, that like they're wholeheartedly, you know, think it's such a necessary thing. And it's one of those, like, you know, let me tell you all the right things, and they're just as charismatic out publicly around the topic, and then inside the athletic and the training environment, it's very abusive. And we are looking at leadership in this area where the only check mark is how good are your athletes. And it should be a check mark of you know, the mental health and the well-being and everything else that goes with the wholeness of the person, and that their rights their human rights haven't been violated through this process, but we miss that.
Andy, you're listening to what Catherine and Anne have said, nodding. As somebody who's been involved in sport, in different sports for quite a while, what does it make you feel to hear their stories?
I mean, I think I was sitting there listening to Gloria, and aside of the fantastic work that she's doing in terms of raising the awareness of this, what it reinforces to me is the duty of care that we as national governing bodies have, and the sense of responsibility that we have in making sure that the environment that people are participating in, as well as competing in, is enjoyable. And that goes from all the way from our elite team all the way down to the Riverside. I guess the real challenge that I would imagine most sports face at the moment is one of being slightly overwhelmed by the complexity, by how to deal with these types of situations. In the previous set, you talked about the confidentiality element, which is so fundamental. But you know what? Sport's not actually very good at that. We tend to operate in quite closed environments where people know each other a lot. So the confidentiality piece is so important, which then leads the conversation to the simple fact of good governance. If you've got a system in place that can allow people to talk to you openly, with confidence that you're going to do something about it, then you've got a shot at least providing a safe environment for your people.
We heard from Gloria, Michael, that the Spanish Gymnastics Federation seemed to be in complete denial at what was happening to its athletes. Is that something that's reflected in your experience that you've had as well, that people don't really know what their coaches are getting up to?
I think generally there is a shift, and it's only happened quite recently within the last few years, but there's been a shift from a culture of what we term sort of disbelief of a victim of abuse, which is reflected very well with sort of in Gloria's experience, and to a culture of belief, and the triggers that have changed that culture. There's more work to be done, and we'll come on to the Goddard inquiry in a minute, no doubt, but what the trigger for that change, which has encouraged victims to come forward, the triggers were the Savile revelations, and followed very closely by the child sexual abuse revelations in Rotherham and other local authorities, which really pushed the issue of child abuse in very different sectors to the top of the agenda, and gave a lot of victims who were sort of had for years and years and years not been able to come forward with their experiences, gave them the confidence to do that. And it's a change in that culture, which was there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm sure there are a lot of institutions, including sport institutions, that need to put in place processes that encourage the victims to come forward. But there's a change.
Michael mentions Savile, and we know now that he was one of the most vile paedophiles that this country has seen. Is the level of the abuse that his victims suffered, is that replicated in sport, do you think? Are there coaches doing to young athletes what Savile did to his victims?
Undoubtedly there are. We do need to have some more willingness from governing bodies to share their case data with us to help us have a full picture. But all of the research that's been done, wherever there are children and young people, wherever there are vulnerable or adults at risk, there will be people who seek to harm them. The things that make a difference are the culture in those environments. What we're seeing through the Goddard inquiry and other institutional abuse inquiries around the world is a focus on how institutions operate and how leadership operates to create a culture where any issues that are arising will be picked up. If you have a closed community where people aren't able to speak out, where there aren't policies and procedures, then that's an environment that's ripe to be abused. I think we're moving very much in the right direction in the UK, but there are a lot of organisations that don't face the scrutiny that the Sports Council's put on the organisations in the UK, and that's one of the places that we really do need to be looking. All the unregulated bodies, we may have a new governance code coming, but we do need to ask the questions about the sports bodies that aren't actually subject to those requirements. What do we do about those? What do we do about private leisure operators and people who aren't currently being scrutinised? Because those will be environments where abuse will occur.
Catherine, we heard that you're a survivor of abuse yourself. I don't know how much you are able to discuss that with us, but you're talking to other victims of abuse all the time. What sort of stories are they telling you?
Well, the abuse ranges from sexual, joking, touching from your coach to, ongoing sexual relations. So it varies, and I think what the most frustrating part of it is that these initial barriers, boundaries that are broken down, and Gloria talked about that, like the boundaries that get broken along on the way.
She talked about seduction at one point.
Yeah.
In her account, and seduction when you're talking about a 12-year-old child, it couldn't be more inappropriate.
Well, and if I could share like kind of a personal story that happened along the way. So I was training with Sharon Davis for a couple years, and then she retired, and I moved to Coventry, and that's where I was training with Paul Hickson. And I was at that stage of my career. I had just turned 13, and I had made the British national team, and I was the youngest person on the team, and so I was interviewed by ITV, like the local Midlands ITV, and so the TV cameras come in, and because I was an American and I moved over to Britain, I'd already been quite popular in the news, just training with Sharon Davis and what have you, and but I'm having this interview, and I'm in my swimsuit, and the Coventry Swim Center is all glass. It's just very exposing, and I'm sitting on the bench there, and he just places his hand on me during this interview and starts rubbing my leg.
Who is he?
Paul Hickson, who was my abuser. And I remember sitting there with the you got the camera person and you have the person who's doing the sound, and just to feel like so exposed and so publicly, like here I am on getting filmed, and this abuse is like happening in broad daylight, and nobody stopped it. And this was and so that was like the beginnings of, and it happened before then. I was already being groomed along the way, but that was like that pivotal moment of nobody will believe me. And here I am, like in a very public way. And they went on with the interview, and I was the superstar, and and that was like the end of that. There was no defense after that. All the doors had been closed to communicate.
What happened to him?
Well, I think it was a very public trial. So the person I was actually training with brought the trial forward. And I believe he got the longest sentence. I wasn't involved in the original trial. I believe he got the longest sentence for his abuse, and he was the British head Olympic coach during my whole time that I experienced it from that age through 21 when I finished my career. And then my understanding is that he came out of prison and then committed suicide.
It's shocking, Anne, isn't it, that these things happened and that they happened so publicly as well. And we heard, didn't we, from Gloria, that she felt very unprotected, that even though people probably knew that there was something wrong, that she didn't have any recourse to help from. She was let down by everybody.
And I think at that point in time, sport was really not set up to respond to safeguarding concerns. Sport was seen as sport for sport's sake. It wasn't particularly well connected into the rest of the normal world, really, in terms of dealing with these kind of issues. And I think it's fair to say we have seen a sea change in the last 15 years. Having spent 20 years in local authority work, I've been immensely impressed by how the majority of sport over the last 15 years in the UK has responded and done something about it. I think one of the things that's important to point out, though, is when we started, it was all about trying to prevent the most serious abusers from doing what they were doing, and it was a risk prevention approach. And whilst that still stands, one of the things that's been really important is to be able to paint a picture for leaders of sport that actually the benefits of good safeguarding practice, the benefits of valuing your athletes, the benefits of creating a positive environment in which your athletes and participants can thrive. And I think it's really important today that we get the balance in that. If you have that sort of environment, it's just the same as in families. There was a lot of research done in the 1990s in the United Kingdom on what created the best environments and the worst environments for children. And the worst environments for children were those which were emotionally harsh and critical and didn't view children as individual human beings with individual needs, but treated them as objects. That is still remains one of the issues for talent and elite sport around commodification of athletes, where you can feel you can treat them differently because they're not treated as individual human beings.
I mean, if I can, I mean, that was what was interesting, I think, with Gloria's story and also yours. In sport, you're operating in such a hierarchical environment, you get told to do stuff, right? And that's not just at the elite level. I guess one of my biggest concerns, if you want to put it that way, is that we as a national governing body can get our framework, our systems in place, but I've got 550 clubs out there, mostly run by volunteers who, frankly, are probably a bit over bureaucracy coming from the top. You've got to do this, you've got to do that, there's suddenly a new requirement on them. Most people are doing this as their hobby. And the real challenge is to get that culture change all the way down the system so that you then stop these things happening further up the system. But, well, that's the bit I think that most people get overwhelmed by. How do you do that? And we've used the CPSU, fantastic service. Same with Sports Resolutions, fantastic, not just because I'm sitting here and had a nice dinner last night. But, I mean, there is some really good expertise out there, and I guess the lesson that I've learned in 15 months in this role is go and talk to the experts. Find out what you can do, don't be scared of the situation.
Michael, as we are covering such a broad range, as we've said, and we're going all the way from the elite level down to the grassroots level as well. But do sports governing bodies have to take responsibility for those lower level clubs as well? Is there some kind of corporate responsibility that they have to be aware of?
Absolutely, and that's one of the real challenges within the sort of sporting environment and the structures by which it's set up. And you've just said very clearly the fact that from the top you're having to manage hundreds and hundreds of smaller parts of your organisation, and your child protection policies will need to disseminate down right to every level, because there is a potential for your organisation to have a legal liability for the outcome of any assaults and abusive conduct carried out by those under your wing who you have responsibility for. There's a legal term called vicarious liability, which means employer is responsible and legally liable for in the cases we're talking about, the assaults of their employees. But the employee-employee relationship is a very wide one and has been widening over the course of the years, and is now simply means if you have someone within your organisation who is doing the bidding of your organisation, and you have put them in a position of risk where this sort of abuse can take place, you will then find yourself having a legal liability for that assault, and then obviously a liability to pay compensation for it.
And to broaden it out, we saw the Adam Johnson case earlier this year, where he was convicted of inappropriate sexual relations with an underage girl. And there was a lot of debate about how much responsibility the football club should take for the fans of that club. I mean, is that something that would have sent a lot of shockwaves and concern to other sporting organisations?
Very much so. I mean, you won't be surprised to learn that there are some legal grey areas around all this, but there are certainly serious risks that if, as a club, you're sending out someone as an ambassador of your club, and that person is at one level doing your club's bidding, then the line of responsibility, legal liability, may well come back to you as the organisations responsible for them.
In an ideal world, of course, we don't want to get to legal cases, do we, Catherine? And I know that your organisation gives advice to coaches, to organisations, to sporting bodies, and also to parents about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate behaviour. And, of course, when you're working with swimmers, with gymnasts, with young people, there is going to be a certain amount of physical contact between a coach and an athlete. But what is right and what is wrong?
I think people think that there's like this big gray area on that topic, but there's really not. There's appropriate technique and everything, but I mean, I'm an advocate just to explain what you're going to do. So it's like, okay, we need to touch you here in order, to spot you or whatever. It just requires communication. In a respectful way. But, it's like I had a situation where the athlete was, the coach purposely put the athlete in a dangerous situation that it made them rely upon this coach in an inappropriate way. And, and it was like, because there was no oversight of the coach is how that sort of came about. But
so can you give us more details of of that situation?
Well, I've had several of that type of situation, but just certainly there was a situation actually in gymnastics, and the way that the coach positioned themselves to spot was to grab their upper thighs inappropriately, and and it was because they were doing it wrong, So, but nobody was in the oversight of any of that. But it created this false dependence, and you're a child, you can't say anything. There is no voice, and it's been certainly the tagline of Safe for Athletes is give an athlete a voice. But and I find that there's so many excuses that you haven't really heard to the facts. And then I also find that you have a young person is being asked to have a vocabulary of an adult. And so there's this misconnect behind, like, he's creepy, it's this happening or this, and they can't really explain to you exactly in words that you need to file a form and to have this legal complaint. So I actually have spent a lot of time being like a translator from a young person's experience to get to the words and to get to something to where there can be an actionable place to go. And because there's little incidences that, they touched me on my shoulder here, they did this here, and they did, but they add up to this whole experience. But those one incidences, we just kind of, it was just this, or it was an accident. But let me just tell you, 10 incidences aren't an accident, So, and that's where I think that we don't spend the time truly listening and really getting a bigger picture. And that's how I think we create the gray area ourselves.
Because there's not a grey area, is there?
No.
In my view, limited experience, there isn't a grey area. It's about appropriate behaviour and inappropriate behaviour. And I've had plenty of conversations recently, and I'm like, no, look, it doesn't matter whether you're an employer, an employee, an athlete, a coach, it's inappropriate to do that. So I think there is a little bit of people trying to confuse the issue a little bit. which sends people into a bit of a spin because they then start questioning whether their judgment is right or wrong and whether to press the button or not. And I just think it's a very black and white thing. It's appropriate or it's not.
Also, these situations do arise as a consequence of a lack of or inadequate child protection procedures and processes. And from the experience of managing cases, you can see how issues have arisen where there might, as you said, there might be 10 instances of inappropriate conduct, but they've been reported to 10 different people. So no one person has been able to assess that, hold on a minute, this is a repetition and it's going wrong and something should be done about it. So there's a procedure and a process there that's failing.
This is a quote from Professor Celia Brackenridge, who's been researching sex abuse in sport for more than 15 years. And she said in 2002, everyone talks about the perils of doping, but if there were 100 drugs cases under investigation in football, or 60 in swimming, or 40 in tennis, there would be uproar. Yet that's the scale of the problem with sex abuse today. This is in 2002. Have things improved, Anne, since then?
In the UK, absolutely, things have improved, but not everywhere. The many governing bodies that are represented here today, the county sports partnerships that have been funded and have worked through standards processes, they have made massive changes in 15 years. But there will always be some dangerous people in all walks of life, but there are some particular areas now that Celia, I'm feeling a bit emotional about this now because Celia's very perilously ill at the moment, and I think we're all slightly affected by that. We're very much more aware now of where the bigger risk areas are. There's been more investment in research, more investment in evidence to paint the picture of where we need to focus our attention. And that is about setting a standard of behaviour across sport, making it clear what the expectations of that are, but looking at areas where we know there are significantly more risks. Talented and elite young athletes are unequivocally at more risk than other athletes. Disabled athletes are more at risk. Children from BME groups are more at risk, and we need to start focusing for the next few years on where are the hidden where are things hiding in the shadows that we need to do more about.
Are there people that you know, Catherine, who feel like these things are happening in the shadows and there's no help for them?
I think there's a combination of having this consequence of, if I speak up, what's going to happen to my career? So at the highest of levels, I have peers of mine who've were on their country's Olympic team, and their own child is, at an elite level and been involved with a coach, and they themselves can't, make action to make the change out of fear of the governing bodies not being able to take the right action. But then there's also the fear of this person they're getting this training. And that's the piece where we need to break that bond and have a safe way to remove somebody from their elite training environment, because they're sort of a single site of, well, where else do I go? And there's this unknown of what's going to happen to you. And I don't believe that picture and that pathway is very light. And so as a result, there's like, well, I can withstand this or stay in this until after my career is over. And I would like to be able to see that those actions can happen in the moment, at the time, and that you're not viewing as this is a career suffering change, but this is a career positive experience. And I have worked with athletes, removing them from situations, and I'm now seeing them thrive in the sport. So they were going from a place of having to lose their sport altogether to being able to make this shift confidentially and then get back into their sport and then pursue the levels that they are desiring to pursue.
So these are people who won't speak out because they're afraid that would end their sporting career.
Correct.
One of the things I think it's important to say as well is the role that sport has got to protect children in other environments as well. We're seeing a massive change in government policy, very much more focused on the social good, the health benefits that sport can do. That will bring more young people who are vulnerable into sport, and we need to be prepared for that. We need to train people to understand the concerns that they might identify through sport, because sport can be a tremendously important vehicle for recovery for some young people from some of the abusive experiences they face in other areas of their life. And that has been one of the biggest changes from when we started. To start with, people were very focused on the most horrendous things that were happening in sport and not seeing the benefits that sport could provide to children who might be struggling in other areas. That again has been a sea change.
There may be parents listening to this, Catherine, who are thinking about the sports that they want their children to do, and as Anne says, that it can be so hugely beneficial in so many ways. And they might be worried now, having heard this. What would you say to them?
I would say that there's, first there's resources available, to be able to speak up. But what I'd also say is, know that you have the ability to make sure that that sporting environment has the appropriate safeguards in place. And there are channels to go and to pursue that. And really don't put your child in an environment where all the doors are closed and there isn't a way to speak up. And no coach is more powerful than the topic of safeguarding. And and there's I'm an advocate to I'm a huge advocate of sport in itself and the benefits of being an athlete and how it shapes you and your ethics of self. And that's what I feel that we also have to have the moral and ethical integration from everybody who touches any person in sport around those elements. And so, but just telling a parent to know you're putting them in the environment and know you can say no. And I essentially have really helped people to be able to say you don't have to stay there. And it's disappointing when someone doesn't want that help, but you do not have to stay in a toxic situation. And the reason I sort of am saying staying is that the evidence does show that people stay in abuse over multiple years is the most likely scenario versus a single instance. It becomes normalized within your own experience, and to unnormalize it and walk away, it's okay. There are resources to be able to help you do that, so you do not need to stay there.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. Catherine Starr from Safe for Athletes. We've also heard from Andy Parkinson, Chief Executive of British Rowing, Anne Tivas, Director of the NSPCC Child Protection in Sport Unit, and Michael Pether, Partner at BLM Law, Specialist in Defending Abuse Claims. Now, the whole hour will be available as a podcast via the 5 Live website. Just look for 5 Live Sports Specials. And if you've been affected by anything that you've heard in this programme, there will be details on who you can contact on the 5 Live website. Coming up, it's Question Time Extra Time with Stephen Nolan and John Pienaar. That's after the 5 Live News. And thank you very much indeed to our panellists. Thank you, Andy, Catherine, Michael and Anne. Thank you.